Hello and welcome to In Conversation. I'm Tim Eckott, and my guests today have come all the way to London from South Africa. Ginn Fourie is a white South African whose daughter Lyndi was shot dead in 1993 at the age of just 23. Her killers were from the Azanian Peoples Liberation Army, who'd been fighting against the Apartheid regime. Members of that organisation sprayed a bar with automatic weapons, shooting indiscriminately at the multiracial clientele inside. With Ginn Fourie today is Letlapa Mphahlele. He was the commander of the APLA wing who ordered the attack. Together, they tell a remarkable and very moving story. Now, Ginn and Letlapa work together in the Lyndi Fourie Foundation, trying to bring about reconciliation and healing in South Africa. I asked Ginn to begin by telling me her daughter's story.
Lyndi and her flatmates went to the Heidelberg Tavern that evening just to celebrate the tavern for what it was. It was a multicultural place where students could gather without being kicked out if they weren't the right colour. They had just been there for about 10 minutes and Lyndi was shot point blank range.
And died instantly, as far as you know?
Yes. Being curious as I am, I phoned the forensic pathologist to find out if she had lived for any length of time. And he said no, the one shot had gone right through her carotid arteries and the front side of her vertebral bodies. She was a young woman. She'd gone out with her friends. She was not a politically active person. She was not involved in politics or with the South African government at the time, nothing like that. No, not actively, but she was very empathic with the cause of black people in South Africa in terms of persuading her white colleagues and students that what was happening in South Africa really wasn't right. And this was in 1993. Yes. So this was at the time when apartheid was ending. Yep, and she was just so delighted that there were going to be free and fair elections in April. This happened at the end of December in 93, just after her 23rd birthday. Letlapa Mphahlele, what was your involvement in that Heidelberg Tavern incident?
At the time the incident took place, I was Azanian Peoples Liberation Army, APLA, Director of Operations. So in a nutshell, this is an operation that I actually authorized. So it was at my command that operation took place. Specifically, you knew that the plan was to attack a crowded bar. Did you know the detail of it, or why were you feeling that this kind of action was necessary? Well, as for the details of it, I did not know, but that it was going to take place in a white suburb that I knew. Of course, the reason why I had to do that is because a month earlier, 5 school children were shot dead by a South African Defence Force in a suburb of Umtata. It's a town in Eastern Cape, South Africa. So it was more of a retaliatory operation. Ginn Fourie has just explained that this was 1993. Multi-party democracy was returning to South Africa. Apartheid was ending. Why did you still feel, even at that stage, apart from this, the killing of the school children you mentioned, why did you still feel that the time was right for violent action? Well, one has to contextualize it because at the time, actually, violence was at its worst. And the same year, we had a massacre in the city center of Johannesburg. And of course, I don't want to talk about people being massacred on the trains, on the buses, mini taxis. And politically, as PAC, Pan-Africanist Congress, we had not declared a ceasefire or cessation of hostilities. So we were at war at the time. And Ginn Fourie, you've said that your daughter Lyndi, who was killed, was not an overtly political person. Apart from the terrible personal grief of losing your daughter,
What did you feel about what you came to know about why the shooting had taken place in the Heidelberg Tavern, the fact that your daughter was a victim of what presumably you called terrorism at the time?
You know, it's an interesting journey because I embarked on a doctorate on forgiveness and conciliation in South Africa after Lyndi died, and then discovered from a psychological and historical and sociological perspective what had actually happened in Africa, and it wasn't just South Africa. And one author, René de Pestre from Algeria, along with Frans Fanon, articulated how desperate black people were because they just weren't being listened to. And I think what impressed me enormously was René de Pestre's poem that says, "What have we done, we the wretched black people of the earth, for the whites to hate us so? What have we done to weigh so little in their scales?"
So you made an intellectual journey on one level to get a better understanding about how this situation, this war between white and black in Africa had progressed, how the situation had come about that people felt it necessary to embark on the kind of action that ended up with your daughter dying. How did you and Letlapa connect then? How did you find out that Letlapa was even involved in the organization which was behind the incident?
The clarity came for me at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when I think Letlapa took responsibility. Didn't you, Letlapa? Somehow in the press, you were acknowledged as the director of operations.
And you, Letlapa, you also wrote a book about your experiences in APLA, didn't you, about being a freedom fighter?
Yeah, correct. I did write a book. And of course, at the time, I went public, claiming responsibility for all APLA operations that took place while I was East Director of Operations.
So when did you physically meet for the first time?
Physically, we met on the 22nd of October, 2002, at the launch of my book, Child of This Soil, My Life as a Freedom Fighter.
Did you know that Ginn Fourie, the mother of Lyndi, was going to come to meet you? Had you had any warning that you might be approached by somebody who might hold you responsible for her death?
Yes, indeed, but not specifically Ginn Fourie. My publisher did warn me that in the audience there might be people whose relatives died as a result of my orders, or even survivors of the attacks of Azanian Peoples Liberation Army. Well, I expected that they would be there, and actually I think there was one gentleman whose son got injured but survived the attack. I'm not sure whether it was St. James or Heidelberg. But when Ginn stood up and identified herself, I think it was more than I was warned. I didn't know that someone who had lost a daughter would still have the courage to attend the book launch.
Your political convictions presumably had not changed, but how did you feel to be confronted by someone who was holding you responsible for the loss of their child?
Well, at the time, I thought that we were nearing the end because journalists had, exhausted their questions by and large. But when Ginn identified herself, I sort of, felt like unsettled and unnerved because I wasn't prepared for that.
Ginn, what did you want Letlapa to do by standing up there in public at the launch of his book? What did you expect?
Well, I wanted to know who this person was because I had considered him an evil person.
Did you feel hatred? Did you feel anger?
Yes, I was surprised by the anger in my voice, but I heard the anger in my voice.
But what did you want? Did you want to shame him? Did you want him to acknowledge what he'd done? Did you just want to express your bitterness? Did you have a clear idea in your head about what that confrontation was going to achieve?
I wanted to know why he didn't participate in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so I asked him if he hadn't trivialized the whole process, because I had met the 3 young men who'd been involved in the attack at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he had been nowhere to be seen when he was the mastermind. So I wanted to know who this was and why he didn't participate.
Some people would naturally assume that meeting the 3 men who actually carried out the attack would be more traumatic. Was that the case, or was it the case that Letlapa, for you as the planner behind it, was more important in a way?
That's a difficult question to answer, because the way things happened was that I was unable to meet with him before that. He was either in prison or out of the country or ducking and diving somewhere. So this was the first opportunity, and I was determined to make the best of it.
Did you, though, then both get a chance to sit down alone and talk about, well, particularly your feelings, Ginn, and your coming to terms with facing somebody who had those kinds of feelings? When did that happen?
Yeah, Letlapa came to me straight after the press conference and asked if we as a family would meet with him. And so I offered my diary for him to write his telephone number so that I could consult with my family. And we then arranged to meet at the Parliament buildings, just as a central point.
And who went along? Was it just you?
Just me.
What about other members of the family? Did they not want to take part?
My husband didn't, and my son was in here in the UK.
Why did your husband not want to meet Letlapa?
He felt that he was not interested in meeting the person responsible for his daughter's death. And I fully understand that. But I have an extremely curious nature, and I need to know all the details.
You'd presumably had time to process the fact that you'd now put a face to the man that you held responsible. What sort of mood did you approach that meeting in?
Well, at the book launch, Letlapa took responsibility for the attacks, and through that I had gained respect for his integrity.
So that immediately was a huge shift in your feelings.
Huge shift. And the fact that his perception of the TRC was that it was biased, that the Defence Force members who had committed worse atrocities than his cadres were still in the Defence Force, whereas his cadres were in jail. And the unfairness of that is what whipped the carpet out under my feet, helped me to understand in this specific instance where that enormous prejudice is or was between black and white.
Has your husband yet met Letlapa?
Yes, he's met Letlapa, and he says he's forgiven Letlapa, but he's not willing for conciliation and hasn't given Letlapa the opportunity to extend the conciliatory process to him, because for my understanding of forgiveness, that the wounded forgives the perpetrator, and then the perpetrator can either say thank you very much and walk away, or extend an invitation to more communication and a deeper understanding of what happened from their side. And that's what Letlapa did. When we met at Parliament, he invited me to his homecoming ceremony, which was, 2 months later.
Just to go back to that, Letlapa, what again were you expecting when this lady came to see you in your office? Were you expecting her still to be angry on some level?
I was surprised in the sense that I expected a lot of anger from her, even if, we had the first encounter at the book launch. And what I was looking forward to was simply to tell my story, to make her understand why I resorted to violence. And it was more of telling her who I am, my upbringing, and why I ended up in the Liberation Army, and why ultimately my action caused the death of her daughter, Lyndi.
Did you feel at the time or since, did you ever feel that you had anything to apologize for?
It was more about telling the story and for her to know what is it that happened. And of course, out of that telling of the story, well, everything would depend on her, whether she understood or she did not understand.
But that makes it sound very one-sided. So I think people will still wonder, do you on any sort of personal level feel that you have needed to apologize, or do you feel still that what happened at the Heidelberg Tavern was necessary and therefore there is nothing to apologize for?
Well, one cannot say there was nothing to apologize for, because the death of a person is always regrettable. And I regretted that people died as a result of my command. As for apology, saying sorry, I've heard a lot of people saying sorry. I did 1, 2, 3. Sorry, I took a drink and ended up drunk. And the following day, the same person is going to say sorry for getting drunk. So for me, it becomes a cheap talk. What is important and even nobler is your action, your show of remorse in a more meaningful way. But I must add that Ginn said she forgave me. And just to give you a background, as we were moving towards the entrance of the parliament, of course, she asked me whether I believed in God, and I'm an atheist. And she asked me whether I believed in spirituality. Yes, I do. And she went on to say, I forgive you for what you have done. Now, it came as a surprise, as a shock. And in that moment, of being shocked, I felt that I should reciprocate in a more meaningful way. And what could be a more meaningful way than the journey that Ginn and I undertook together.
Letlapa, you mentioned earlier, one of the things that came out of that meeting at Parliament was that you invited Ginn to your village, to your homecoming ceremony. What did you think that would achieve? I mean, you were taking a white woman into an African community, into groups of people who were not used to being visited by white South Africans. And what did happen? What was the community response?
To start with, as we were in the trenches, we said we were waging a people's war. And when we were on a forgiveness path, it had to be a people's-based forgiveness, which means communities had to be taken on board. Remember, we were an irregular army. We did not have supplies from the state. People who gave us food and clothing were ordinary people. And those ordinary people had to be put on board so that we should share together this miracle of forgiveness.
You call it a miracle. That's a God word, isn't it?
Well, even atheists do use God, but with a small g. I don't think it's a God word. In South Africa, we have someone who was not God, but we call it Madiba miracle, Mandela miracle. But I'm not using it in a biblical sense. So, hence, I had to invite her, but not, to my community, but not only that, even to the cadres, because, following the meeting in my home village, we had another meeting that included the people who were in the operation and even the guy who actually pulled the trigger. So it was in a way to give this interpersonal forgiveness exercise a wider scope, and that wider scope had to include the community. The event could have taken place earlier, but charges against me, terrorism, arson, and I think all in all there were 4 charges were withdrawn. And after that, the family or the community in my home village said, now we can formally have a welcome home ceremony, which is a spear cleansing ceremony, because in African tradition, when people go out to war, at the end of the war, spears are cleansed and some rituals are committed. Well, I don't believe in rituals, but of course, it's just a way of saying, now you are integrating into the community. And there could not be no better way of cleansing the spear with people who were on the opposite side of you.
Let's talk about the Lyndi Fourie Foundation. What does it do, Ginn?
The Lyndi Fourie Foundation was established to essentially assist ex-combatants on all sides of the political spectrum who are still suffering from post-traumatic stress. And we have found an homogenous community in the San people 10 k's out of Kimberley in the Northern Cape who were trackers for the South African Defence Force from Namibia and Angola.
These are black Africans who worked for the predominantly white defence forces, who once called Bushmen, who now find themselves excluded
totally
from black society in South Africa because they were seen as pawns of the regime, I suppose.
Exactly. And there is lots of post-traumatic stress, as well as dislocation from their homeland and all that goes with that.
And for you, Letlapa, what do you want the foundation to achieve? What are you two doing that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't set out to do? Because that's held up internationally as an example of how a very fractured society, which was at war with itself, deals with terrible things and brings them out in the open. What does the Lyndi Fourie Foundation do that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission couldn't do?
Well, I don't think it will be fair to compare the two in terms of what they are doing or what they are not doing. If anything, really, to complement what the TRC had started in terms of bringing communities together. Remember that to this day, we are still apart geographically because apartheid nailed, separation through the geographics. We know Soweto is the township of the indigenous Africans, and you know that Houghton would be the African middle class, but the majority of the residents would be, and even their experiences would differ, really. So we did have a joint project with some people whereby our story would be used, in the boardroom for people to address their differences.
So you see a common purpose. Are you friends?
Well,
or do you just work together?
Well, the question of friend, especially in a foreign language, which is English, in my mother tongue, it would be simple. But I think our working together has blossomed into friendship.
What about you, Ginn? Do you call Letlapa a friend now?
Absolutely. I would call him a brother.
Is that something you could ever have envisaged back in 1991?
No. And I told Letlapa at the homecoming ceremony in front of his community that if I'd met him in the first year of Lyndi's death, I would have at least tried to strangle him with my bare hands.
It sounds though, Ginn, you've been on a remarkable journey, a learning journey in terms of learning about your own culture, about being a South African, about the history of the country and how things came to such a terrible pass that people on both sides did terrible things to each other to achieve their political aims. That's a personal, intellectual, but then an emotional journey about coming to terms in some way with the loss of your daughter unexpectedly. And Letlapa, when you talk about it, seem to talk about it in a broader cultural and political framework. For you, it sounds like it's been more of an intellectual journey. Is that fair, or am I being unfair?
Well, I wouldn't say it is more of intellectual journey.
Have your political convictions changed at all?
Maybe it's a combination of all. Political, spiritual, intellectual journey. As for my political convictions, they haven't changed in terms of, struggling for the equality, especially for the empowerment and emancipation of the African people. But the means and methods of achieving that has changed.
Would you still advocate armed struggle in a similar situation? Would you do it all over again if the clock was turned back?
Well, I don't want to fight yesterday's wars today, but confronted with, one is confronted with, which I think basically is just political freedom without economic power. I think, and to a large degree, I owe this to Ginn, that there are other effective ways of fighting oppression, and you can do it without unleashing violence, but with the determination and courage to absorb it. And I no longer espouse armed struggle.
It sounds like a cliche, Ginn Fourie, but do you in some way accept that your daughter's death was something that had to happen to bring you to this point, or to bring South Africa to the place it is now?
I resonated with my aunt, who is a famous white South African Ginn van der Spey. When she was 100 years old and it was Lyndi's birthday, I went out to her beautiful homestead and I said to her, Aunt Una, it's Lyndi's birthday today. And she looked into the horizon and she said, of course, that Lyndi was killed as a sacrifice for all of us white South Africans. And I think that had come about because at Letlapa's homecoming ceremony, I had apologized for what my British ancestry had done through slavery, through colonialism, through the Anglo-Boer War, which I think was the reason for apartheid. So she had not agreed with me on that score to start with. But in saying that, she actually acknowledged the kind of guilt that white people have, although it's often subliminal, for what has happened.
Let me just ask you both the same question. Are you hopeful about the future for South Africa? Because the message coming out to the outside world is very mixed, particularly in the light of the recent elections. Are you optimistic, Ginn Fourie?
Yes, I'm very optimistic. Even more so if we can get the caliber of politicians into Parliament that Letlapa is. If we can get that kind of honest, compassionate politician.
And you, Letlapa, is there such a thing as a happy modern South Africa where white South Africans and black South Africans are just South Africans and will accept each other on that basis?
Yes, I share the optimism. And I think all countries do have challenges and we must accept it.
But South Africa has a particular and peculiar set of historical circumstances to get to grips with, doesn't it?
Correct. Yes, but we have had some hiccups, but we haven't had a fundamental and glaring undermining of the Constitution. Remember that South Africa is a constitutional democracy, and Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And no one has so far flouted that Constitution. I don't think the people today or even tomorrow can accept to be divided on the race card.
Are you an African, Ginn?
Yes, I am an African.
Do you accept the existence of white Africans?
It's so surprising because when the organization to which I belong, the Pan-Africanist Congress, was founded in 1959. Its founding father, Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, said we have only one race, the human race. But he went further to say, yes, indeed, we should regard ourselves as Africans. Africans by history and African by adopting and embracing Africa. I avoid as much as possible to call people black and white.
And wasn't it Kwame Nkrumah who said,
yes,
some people are born in Africa,
yes,
and for others, Africa is born in them?
You've been listening to In Conversation. I'm Tim Eckott, and my guests today were Ginn Fourie and Letlapa Mphahlele from the Lyndi Fourie Foundation in South Africa. You can find out more information about their organisation and the work they do by visiting the website www.lyndifouriefoundation.org.za.
She was just so delighted that there were going to be free and fair elections in April. This happened at the end of December in 93, just after her 23rd birthday.
Letlapa Mphahlele, what was your involvement in that Heidelberg Tavern incident?
At the time the incident took place, I was Azanian Peoples Liberation Army, APLA, Director of Operations. So in a nutshell, this is an operation that I actually...
Side of her vertebral bodies.
She was a young woman. She'd gone out with her friends. She was not a politically active person. She was not involved in politics or with the South African government at the time, nothing like that.
No, not actively, but she was very empathic with the cause of black people in South Africa in terms of persuading her white colleagues and students that what was happening in South Africa really wasn't right.
And this was in 1993.
Yes.
So this was at the time when apartheid was ending.
Yep. A tavern, for what it was a multicultural place where students could gather without being kicked out if they weren't the right colour. They had just been there for about 10 minutes and Lyndi was shot, point blank range.
And died instantly, as far as you know.
Yes. Being curious as I am, I phoned the forensic pathologist to find out if she had lived for any length of time. And he said no, the one shot had gone right through her carotid arteries and the front.
Ginn Fourie today is Letlapa Mphahlele. He was the commander of the APLA wing who ordered the attack. Together, they tell a remarkable and very moving story. Now, Ginn and Letlapa work together in the Ginn Fourie Foundation, trying to bring about reconciliation and healing in South Africa. I asked Ginn to begin by telling me her daughter's story.
Lyndi and her flatmates went to the Heidelberg Tavern that evening just to celebrate the...
Hello and welcome to In Conversation. I'm Tim Eckott, and my guests today have come all the way to London from South Africa. Ginn Fourie is a white South African whose daughter Lyndi was shot dead in 1993 at the age of just 23. Her killers were from the Azanian Peoples Liberation Army, who'd been fighting against the apartheid regime. Members of that organisation sprayed a bar with automatic weapons, shooting indiscriminately at the multiracial clientele inside. With